إن الحمد لله وكفاه والصلاة والسلام على رسوله المصطفى وعلى عباده الذين ارتضى ومن بهداهم اهتدى وبآثار أهل المدينة اقتفى وبعد. Assalamu alaikum. This is session 2 of Al-Andalus from Rise to Fall. We took a look last lesson at the importance of Islamic history, the importance of the sciences, and an overview and just some glances really into what we will be covering and what is meant when we say Al-Andalus from Rise to Fall. So going through each of the stages very briefly. Right, today, bi'idhnillah, we're going to take a look at session 2, which is to do with the key figures, the people who were involved with the in the conquest of Al-Andalus. And I don't just mean by that the actual the person like Tariq ibn Ziyad and so on who we're going to speak about. I mean all the key figures who were the people that were involved one way or another, whether that was from the Muslim side, from the Christian side, what was the geopolitics taking place, really the backdrop to the advent of the Muslims to the peninsula. So we're going to take a look at that, and also leading up to the actual Battle of Wadi Birbat and what that was about. So here are objectives, if you like, for today to understand what this, and this is now further breaking it down into more detail. So the conquest, the liberation of North Africa, because Al-Andalus can only follow on from North Africa. So what was all that about? Who conquered it? What were the problems that were faced during that conquest or liberation, and how does this play a role in Al-Andalus? Then also some issues of conversion versus indoctrination. These are just some things we'll briefly take a look at. We'll also look at who was Uqba ibn Nafi' radiallahu an, a brief look into his life, who was Musa ibn Nusayr. These are the key people that are involved. Tariq ibn Ziyad, who was he? We'll take a look at that, some background into his life, into where he came from, where he went, and how he managed to achieve what he did, bi'idhnillah. King Rodrigo, or Rudrick, or Ludric, as they call him in Arabic, of Spain. The previous king before him, and what type of an impact did that have on the Muslim arrival. Also things like the strategy and preparation for this conquest that took place. Then the decisive battle of Wadi Birbat, and also looking into some relevant issues, because there's the khutbah of Tariq ibn Ziyad and the burning of the ships, the Ihraq al-Sufan. We'll take a look at that, fact or fiction. Okay, so, and we'll kind of discuss that as well, and briefly touch up on the concept of Jizya. So, because this is quite important as well, because it's there and it's discussed, so perhaps we need to know a bit about it as well. That's what we'll be taking a look at today. Right, before we go into anything, we have to understand now that Islam, after or during the time of the Khulafa al-Rashidun, had been making really from the time of Umar radiallahu anh, there were already advances made into Egypt and so on, but not really North Africa. During the time of Uthman radiallahu anh, advances are made into North Africa. But there's a companion who we hear a lot about when we speak of North Africa historically, and that is Uqba ibn Nafi'. Somebody who was born in Mecca. He dies in 63 Hijri. He was born a year before Hijrah. Okay, so that makes him a Sahabi in the sense that he is, although he never actually met the Prophet ﷺ during his lifetime, but because he was alive and a Muslim during the lifetime of the Prophet ﷺ. So from that aspect, we consider him a Sahabi, a companion of the Prophet ﷺ. He was also a nephew of Amr ibn al-As, a great Sahabi, radiallahu an, who was also a very close companion to Muawiyah radiallahu an, and was also the governor of Egypt. Now, Uqba ibn Nafi' was somebody that Umar ibn al-Khattab had commanded to lead certain type of conquests out into different regions and so on, and he had done that on behalf of Umar ibn al-Khattab. This is giving you a bit of background about Uqba ibn Nafi' to understand what was going on here. Eventually, the time of the Khulafa al-Rashidun passes, and you have Muawiyah radiallahu an, who becomes the Khalifa of the Muslims. And I know there's a whole such a set of events that takes place during that time. But like I said before, bi-idhnillah, if Allah wills, some point in the future I would like to perhaps do something on that. But that's for another time, another place. Right now, what we understand from this is, okay, during the time of Muawiyah radiallahu an, he appoints Uqba ibn Nafi', sends him forward into North Africa. He's already in Egypt. He's kind of he's running a lot of things in Egypt, and he's told to go westwards into North Africa, and he does. And he makes huge conquests and liberations. I'm talking dynamic and very rapid. People during his time, like the places, are conquered very rapidly. And he continues to swift westwards across North Africa. And I'm talking within months, like miles and miles and regions are conquered, and cities. And he himself builds a city which he names Qayrawan, which is from the Persian word of Qarawan, which is to do with like a caravan, almost a settlement. So he calls it Qayrawan, and that is where many ulama later emerge, including the likes of Ibn Abi Zayd al-Qayrawani, the Don, the Maliki Don, known as Young Malik. He's also somebody that lived in Qayrawan. But Qayrawan has this huge history about it, but it's built by Uqba ibn Nafi', and it is important because all of this is going on. However, during his conquest, he's moving, and I've got a little map there at the bottom. You can see this, that Uqba ibn Nafi' kind of moves westward across North Africa, but what seems to be happening is behind him, people seem to be rebelling and apostating. It's almost a common phenomenon. So he's struggling, he's going westward, he's coming back, he's having to deal with all these different types of rebellions and so on, and apostasy situations, and his life is really just preoccupied with that. He dies in 63 Hijri. It is important understanding that because it will make sense now for what happens later. You see, because what Uqba ibn Nafi' sets is almost the stage for Musa ibn Nusayr. Now, who was Musa ibn Nusayr? And that's what we have to ask ourselves. Now, people, I want us to reflect upon something that, you see, many people could just and have remained completely oblivious to history, and just in oblivion. They've been non-existent. But sometimes one tiny decision or step has not only casted those people right into the forefront of history, but it's actually redefined history. I want us to pause what's going on here with Musa ibn Nusayr, who is a governor of North Africa. But before we go into that, what I want us to do is I want us to hold that thought and go back in time slightly. We're going back to the time of the Khulafa al-Rashidun. Khalid ibn al-Walid, the sword of Allah, is upon a conquest in the Middle East. There is a particular region which he conquers, and in it there is a church, like a cathedral type of thing, known as Ain al-Tamr. It's named after this area, and they and that comes under Muslim rule, and within it they find held captive are many young people, many young boys who have been held as almost as a type of, their lives have been kind of deposited, if you like, because their parents or somebody owed so much money to somebody, so they had seized their children and held them in captivity until the loans and these things are paid off. But what Khalid bin Walid finds is this room, these chambers full of these teenagers, Christian boys, and amongst them is this person called Nusayr. Now, there's not only Nusayr, there's many of these that they find, and they bring them in, and eventually these people come into the Muslim lands, and amongst them are Nusayr, there's Sirin, there's a person called Yasar, and there's others. Nusayr goes on to actually, he mingles within the Muslim society, he converts to Islam. Whilst living in the cathedral and the church, he had been studying Christianity quite passionately. So he takes an interest in Islam, naturally, because Islam has been very academic by its nature. So he finds the interest, starts learning, starts getting involved. He becomes quite an active type of Muslim. This is Nusayr. He joins up within the army. He starts to serve with under people like Muawiyah radiallahu anh. And in fact, he does so well, Nusayr does, that he is actually put in charge of some naval expeditions. That, you know, and Muslims they weren't experts when it came to the sea, because most of Muslim conquests were done by land. So Muslims were not so skilled when it came to dealing with sea issues and stuff like this. And he's one of the early people that gets involved in that, Nusayr. With him, I mentioned Sirin, who also converts to Islam, and it's his son who is then Ibn Sirin, who goes on, Muhammad ibn Sirin, who is the famous tabi'i who interprets dreams and has his own school of thought, and the entire thing, that's actually Sirin's son. And I mentioned another name, Yasar, whose grandson is Muhammad ibn Ishaq, who goes on to write the famous Sirah book and is the famous historian from the early times. And these, I'm just trying to say, were people who were originally just Christians. They were in this thing. They make one decision. They embrace the deen of Islam. They take particular steps. And not only are their steps engraved in history, they redefine certain parts of history. Nusayr is quite keen with keeping his son with him at all times. And his son is Musa. Now, Musa is born in 19 Hijri. He accompanies his father in most places. He goes with him on some of these expeditions as he's growing up. He goes on these naval expeditions. Right, he in fact is then raised, because his father seems to be doing well in these upper leading classes. His son is raised amongst those classes. So he knows these type of umara and these princes, and they know him and he knows them and stuff like that. So he is actually a key person in terms of almost aristocracy, if you like. Now, he sticks obediently with Muawiyah radiallahu anh. After Muawiyah's time and Yazid's time, he's still with Yazid. And after Yazid, he then joins Ibn Zubayr. And the thing with Musa ibn Nusayr is that you see, when he joins Ibn Zubayr, and that's a whole different, that's something, subhanallah, that is something, this is why I have to say to you that what you have to do is make certain types of bullet points whilst you're learning and go away and do your research, because it is way too difficult to bring everything into the picture. And there are some amazing and spectacular things which really should be known. And things like the incident of Ibn Zubayr and how he rose to Khilafah and became the ruler and so on. But that's something which we can't really go into now, because it will just completely digress. The point is, Musa ibn Nusayr does give his allegiance to Ibn Zubayr, but then with the fall of Ibn Zubayr, he's a bit worried so that there's going to be a backlash. So he goes to Egypt, where there's Abdul Aziz ibn Marwan, who's Umayyad, who is from Bani Umayyah, he's a ruler, and he tells him, look, listen, that I went with Ibn Zubayr, but this was the situation. And he explains to him, and he says, well, basically it wasn't a sense of betrayal. It was just that most people were giving him bay'ah, including many of Bani Umayyah. So did I. So Abdul Aziz kind of accepts it from him, and he recognized this is a skilled person. Musa ibn Nusayr was an absolute commander he knew, a person of military expertise. So what Abdul Aziz does is he thinks, look, this is a skillful person, and I can use this person. So he keeps him, and he says to him, don't worry about it. He ends up kind of putting him in charge of different things, and then different cities, and then eventually most of North Africa is under Musa ibn Nusayr. Now, Musa ibn Nusayr, at that time, there were still a lot of these rebellion issues remaining from the time of Uqba ibn Nafi', where many people apostated, they left the fold of Islam, many people had rebelled. Musa ibn Nusayr thinks, okay, I'm going to go through this, and I'm going to try and bring this whole turbulent ground under control. And the way he does that is he really plans it out. He takes up to 6 to 7 years crossing North Africa, where Uqba ibn Nafi' only took a few months. Every town he goes through, he doesn't just liberate and conquer that town, he sets it up. He calls in ulama. He has educational institutes set up. He understands that the reason why people are rebelling against something is because they don't understand it. So we need to educate these people about the deen. And he starts to teach people. People start to learn Arabic. They start to learn about the Quran. They start to learn about Hadith. Start to learn about Islam. This this demonstrates a huge successful campaign which Musa ibn Nusayr carries out across North Africa. Eventually, the entire North African scene is under Musa ibn Nusayr's control, except 2 places. One is Tanja, and one is Sabta. And Tanja is Tangiers, and Sabta is Sweta, they call it today. And Sabta is also where legendary people like Qadi Iyad and these people are from. So now these 2 type of cities are still unconquered. So what he does is he heads towards Tanja, and with him now is this person Tariq ibn Ziyad, a young person who comes from the Middle East of a Berber background. And Berbers are, a North African type of race or tribe, really, that you can, I suppose, do your own research into it. We've got one Berber on the course with us today, Akh Sharif, and the thing is, that some people say of different mixed origin or whatever, and you can research into it, but they were a difficult people. That they definitely were. What you have is they weren't an easy people to subdue. And Tariq ibn Ziyad, who comes from the Middle East, his father has converted to Islam. So he's born and raised a Muslim. He knows Arabic because he's lived a huge time in the Middle East. He comes over and he's with Musa ibn Nusayr. And they're going, and the 2 last remaining places are Tanja and Sabta. So they go for Tanja and they conquer it, and without much difficulty. They get that. Musa ibn Nusayr is so pleased with Tariq ibn Ziyad that he says to him that I'd like you to be the governor of this region. And he's only something like 18 years of age. Very young person at the time. Now it gets a bit interesting because Sabta is still remaining. Now you might think, well, okay, what's different about Sabta at the time? Well, what's different is Sabta is ruled by a Christian at the time. A king by the name of Julian. Okay, or Julian, they call him. And you see, he's also got certain ties but certain problems with Andalusia. Now, Musa ibn Nusayr is very interested at this point in reaching out to Al-Andalus. He's very interested. But the situation isn't ready. He looks at it, he sees that, wait a minute, there's right now, you've got Sabta where there's King Julian. You've got the fact that we've got to cross some sea to get to Andalusia. And like I mentioned before, Muslims were not leading when it came to sea warfare. Okay, in fact, they lacked ships. They lacked things like naval equipment and stuff like that. And also, such a key thing, they lacked any geographical knowledge of Andalusia. So not only, and they just heard things about it's a mountainous area, it's like this, it's green, it's got a lot of tree forests in there and stuff like that, but they had no idea what it was entirely like. So this is a key thing, because if you just jump into some unknown territory, you are just rushing towards extinction. So what Musa ibn Nusayr does is he concentrates first on other regions, like he concentrates on Sicily. That is also liberated under his rule. He sends his son. He sees that, and he's really eager to go for Al-Andalus, but he's thinking, right, it still isn't right. He looks at it, and when he looks at Al-Andalus, he notices the Balearic Islands. Okay, what they call in Arabic Juzrul Bilyar, which include things like Majorca and these few islands which are towards the southeast of Spain. Now, he thinks that if I advance towards Andalusia, towards the Iberian Peninsula, the Balearic Islands, which at the time were occupied by the Romans, will easily kind of be able to set me up from behind. So he thinks, let's focus first of all on these Balearic Islands. So that's what he does. And that isn't something too difficult. He manages, they have some ships and stuff like this, he gets them, they go across, they liberate the Balearic Islands without much difficulty at all. So whatever fears and problems he had, he feels that they're kind of settled. So at this time, he thinks, okay, well, what should we do? So he sends back he writes back to the Khalifa at the time, Walid ibn Abdul Malik, asking for permission to enter the Iberian Peninsula, because at that time everything has to go through the chain of command. So he goes back to Walid ibn Abdul Malik. Walid ibn Abdul Malik agrees, but he says to him, first, I'd like you to actually check it out. You see, you don't have the background knowledge. Meanwhile, King Julian has some issues with the politics which are going on in Spain. Allahu Akbar. I tell you, many a times have kingdoms collapsed, seriously, because of a mistake or two that some people have conducted just against one person. Politics is so decisive in drawing out the fate of kingdoms. Now, we'll see what we've got to do. We've got to pause all of this, put that all on hold, and we've got to jump up north into the Iberian Peninsula. What's going on over there? You see, in the Iberian Peninsula, you've got a king by the name of Rodrigo, okay, or they call him Roderick as well in English, and he's known in Arabic as Ludrik. Now, Rodrigo, he's from the Gothic Visigoths, so he's from the Gothic type of kingdom, and what he's done is he's kind of come into power, but he's taken over and kind of rebelled against a previous king by the name of Witiza, who in Arabic they call Ghaytasha. Now, the thing is that he kind of betrays Witiza and comes into power. Now you might think, well, that's normal, yeah, there's no big deal. But he not only betrays him, betrays Witiza's family. Now, King Julian happened to be a very close ally to King Witiza. Now they were very tight. Now when he sees Witiza getting betrayed and he gets killed and executed and his possessions are repossessed and all his wealth is taken and stuff like this and his family are deprived of anything, he looks at all of this and he thinks, right, he thinks that, oh God, like I've had enough of this guy Rodrigo. But at the same time, he knows that, look, ultimately here he is in Sabta, and there's the Iberian Peninsula. He's got this little tiny Christian rule, and there you've got some Christian rule in the Visigoths and so on. So there are still bonds which he can't deny. Then, however, further stories and tales have it that his King Julian, his daughter, he takes her, accompanies her with him once into mainland Spain, into the Iberian Peninsula, and goes to visit King Rodrigo. And whilst he's there, he has certain things which, certain business to tend to and things like this. Now, there are different historical events about what happens, but generally, many of the stories relate that King Rodrigo, what he does is he holds Julian's daughter as captive and kind of takes her, enslaves her in a way. Whether he keeps her as an absolute slave but he holds her in captivity. And some people say he maybe eventually killed her, and some people say no, she carried on. I mean, she stayed alive while she was there, but he kind of held her against her will. Now, Julian, he obviously, as soon as he finds out, he returns to the king's palace, whatever, there's nothing he can do. He's got no power against King Rodrigo. He tells him, look, listen, you better unless you want to get executed, you better be on your way. So he returns to Sabta. Now, you see, this has completely enraged him. So he thinks, okay, I'm going to reach out to the Muslims. I'm going to reach out to Musa ibn Nusayr. Allahu Akbar. And this is what we see, the vicissitudes of fate. وَتِلْكَ الْأَيَّامِ نُدَاوِلُهَا بَيْنَ النَّاسِ. And those days, Allah rotates them between people. You see, what he does is he gives a lot of territorial secrets, a lot of strategic insight to Musa ibn Nusayr about the Iberian Peninsula. He says to him, this is what it's like. He provides him maps. He even says that he will provide him ships, that in return, the Muslims just have to see to it that A, Rodrigo is eliminated, and 2, the assets and property of King Witiza are rightfully returned to his own inheritors. The Muslims have no problem with this whatsoever. They think, yeah, that's not a problem. So now with that news, Musa ibn Nusayr, he takes that news. Now if we go back to where we were, to the Khalifa Walid ibn Abdul Malik, and tells him, look, listen, we've got all these insights, we've got this, give us the go ahead. Walid ibn Abdul Malik says to him, look, listen, he says, that's all good. However, you need to have this thing verified for yourself. Send a small group, a small regiment of Muslim soldiers just to kind of scope the region and understand how it is. So Musa ibn Nusayr agrees, and he does that. He sends a person by the name of Tariq ibn Malik, who is quite a significant figure, but you can read up more about him in your own time. He sends him with about 500 Muslims to kind of just scope the southern Andalusian territory. So they do that. They go there, they make maps, they do this. Meanwhile, what does Musa ibn Nusayr do? He heads back to Qayrawan. He instructs from there different Muslim ports to start building ships. And that's what they do. He says that rather than relying on the ships of people like Julian or other people, we should have our own equipment. The verse of Allah, وَعِدُّ, and make preparations. And that's exactly what he does. He goes away, he starts making ships, he starts getting things done. It takes them up to a year to not only get their insight, back to them by Tariq ibn Malik, but also prepare several ships to raise an army. And eventually all they managed to raise is 7,000 soldiers. That's all they eventually managed to do. But they have several ships. They have a reasonable, if you like, a small sized navy. They have some soldiers. They have some insight. They're almost ready. Now we need to just hold the scene there. Just pause that. We need to once again leap up north back into the Iberian Peninsula. Some background into what was going on there with King Rodrigo. Apart from his type of general oppression and oppressive rule, which he was conducting, things like very heavy taxes on people. He lived in an extremely luxurious type of palace, had many assets which he had seized from people and things like that. But besides all of that, there is another myth, people, which is worth, which is quite interesting, and that is in Toledo, where King Rodrigo was. There's a particular river by, I think they call it Tejo or Tejo, they say in Spanish. But on that river there was a tower, and the myth had it, and the legend had it, that this tower was originally built by Hercules. And it was a tall tower, and in it there was, and outside it just had this type of sign on it that do not enter. And it had, "O kings of Spain, do not enter." Now, the legend was that, or the myth was that each king that came into power had to add a padlock onto this particular tower. So every king from the Visigoths and so on that had come had done that. So there were many padlocks on this tower. That's what you had. Now, when it was Rodrigo in rule, and he was reminded, oh, by the way, you've got to go and you've got to kind of add a padlock. It's almost ceremonial. It's like a rite of passage. He thinks about it and thinks, well, you know what? What is inside that tower? And they tell him, his type of ministers and whatever, they tell him, oh, no. Do not make this mistake, please. They say, what we'd like you to do is, look, can you just add a padlock onto this thing? And he says, no. And he says, look, listen, I'm really curious. In fact, he says, I've had enough. I'm going to have that door opened. And so the ministers kind of go away. They have their meeting. They come back to him the next day. They actually say to him look, they say to the king, look, okay, this is the tower. It's of a particular size. At most, and in the best possible scenario, there's going to be treasure inside and wealth. How much wealth do you estimate will be inside? We will double it and give it to you, with the condition that you add a padlock. He says that, hell no. Allahu Akbar. This is the thing, isn't it? Curiosity. Oh, when it gets to somebody. So he says, look, I've had enough. Right, I don't care what you're going to offer me. I want to get inside that tower. So he does. He goes there. He has his soldiers break down the padlocks, and he goes inside. And inside, as the door kind of opens inward, he sees just an empty tower. And inside it there is a table. And on the table there is this parchment, this type of what they used to use for old paper. And it's kind of rolled up. So he goes to it and he folds it out, rolls it out. And on it is a drawing. And it is a drawing of a line of men, horseback. A line of them, a row of them. And they seem to be dressed in white, carrying swords and spears. And it says that when this tower is open, these men will conquer your kingdom. And it is said that in that year, Tariq ibn Ziyad lands. Allahu Akbar. I mean, regardless of the authenticity, is very interesting nevertheless. what we see is Tariq ibn Ziyad, he takes his army of 7,000 soldiers and they cross and they go onto Jabal al-Tariq, which is Gibraltar, and it should be in, which was actually is named after him, and I think they still call it Jabal al-Tariq, but in some of the languages, in English, Gibraltar. Now, and from then he moves forth into southern Andalusia. Now, the issue is when he gets to Andalusia, King Rodrigo, because of what he had discovered at the tower, is extremely paranoid about any advent of any Muslims on the Iberian Peninsula. He is informed that because just before we miss a little bit, when Tariq ibn Ziyad actually lands, there is a small fort or two which happen to be on the southern Iberian Peninsula, which easily crumble to the armies of Tariq ibn Ziyad. Easily. Now, a message gets back to King Rodrigo that some people have arrived, some people have landed from North Africa, Muslims. Now, as paranoid as he was, he's like, whoa, what the, oh, I'm not letting that prophecy realize in my time. So what he does is he collects and assembles an army which is like insurmountable. He actually, people say he raises an army 100,000 strong, just because he's so paranoid. And he doesn't want to engage in any combat. He just wants to crush and squash any opposition that may be coming from the south, from any Muslim territory, especially since he's seen what he's seen of that prophecy. So now Tariq ibn Ziyad hears that Rodrigo Ludwig is coming south with his army and with a massive army. So he doesn't really know what to do at first. So he's thinking, he looks into all his, into the maps and any type of strategy that he has. And there they see this, he sees a particular region which is known as Wadi Birbat, which is a valley of Birbat. It is also referred to as Lekka, and I think they do call it Rio Birbat as well. They spell it as that as well, and that's in Spanish for, I suppose, the river of Birbat. It is also known as Guadalete. I'm not sure how they exactly pronounce that in Spanish, Guadalete or however, but that's also what it's referred to. Now he sees this region, this part, this valley is it's reasonably narrow. It's mountainous on one side to the east and to the south. So that means he's covered on these ends. On the west, there's this particular type of very thick, dense, difficult terrain. So he knows that, that's not, he couldn't get attacked from that side. So basically, whoever wants to come down this way, they will be squeezed into a reasonably narrow valley. A bit similar to what you see in the movie 300. Same type of scheme, really. But so what he does is he thinks this is the place. So he kind of sets up camp at this place. And he asks for reinforcements because he hears that Rodrigo is bringing 100,000 soldiers. And naturally, that is very traumatizing for any people who are just 7,000 in number. And so he asks for reinforcements. Reinforcements are sent by Musa ibn Nusayr, but 5,000 more. So they are now a total of 12,000. And the reason why 5,000 are made up more, and because there is a hadith, although its authenticity has been discussed, but there is a hadith that an army of 12,000 believers will never be defeated entirely. So based on that hadith, Muslims quite often in history, you'll find that whenever they set forth on different territory, it was quite often 12,000 in number. And so that's what takes place here as well. Now, you see the armies, they advance. So the armies advance, You've got King Rodrigo's army coming south. Tariq ibn Ziyad is steadfast there. He's ready, he's set up camp, and they arrive. Now, when they speak of King Rodrigo, they say he arrives on a throne which is carried by 2 horses, which is decorated with gold. The horses are set out with all these type of very expensive jewels and gold and so on, and him and his cavalry, and then he's got obviously many soldiers, and many of these people are there who obviously don't want to be there. Many of these people, many of these soldiers are people who are captives. Many of these are just people who are very underpaid. They do not get a portion of any true success like that. Even if they are successful, what do they achieve out of it? Apart from they probably get a daily allowance, that's all. Many of them still oppressed with heavily taxes and things like this. When you're looking at that on one side, and then you look at the other side, Tariq ibn Ziyad leading an army. He himself is leading an army of many of which are of mixed origin, Berber and Arab, led by a non-Arab who sits and dines with them. They all pray together in one saf. They are people who have a belief in what they are doing. They are people who will share success no matter what the outcome. If they succeed and are victorious, they will get a portion of the ghanima. Every person who contributes gets a portion of the ghanima. Allahu Akbar. This is where you have the verse هَذَانِ خَصْمَانِ اخْتَصَمُوا فِي رَبِّهِمْ, that these are 2 people, 2 parties who have disputed regarding their Lord. Allahu Akbar. And Allah judges over them. And you see that what happens, what takes place here at Wadi Birbat is when the armies of King Roderick, they actually arrive, the battle commences. When it does, it is actually the 28th of Ramadan. So the Muslims, many of them are actually fasting. And it doesn't just go on for like 2 days, 1 day, 12 hours, 10 hours. It goes on for 8 days. 8 days it goes on for. Eid al-Fitr is actually, it is spent in battle. And Muslims, they are advancing because what happens is, as they're going forward, they're kind of advancing slightly. There are losses on both sides. There are Muslim losses, but the losses on the side of King Rodrigo are astronomical. They actually say back that people write back that many of the soldiers say, La nadri. This is how the Muslim kind of historians have documented their statements, that man nazala bina, who has actually come here. They say this army, amin ahlil ardi hum am min ahlis sama. Are they people that have kind of come, are they from the earth? Are they humans like us, or have they descended from the skies? They actually say about them that ruhbanum bil layli wa fursanum bin nahar. They say that at night, because at night they would watch each other. And these people stood in prayer. Many of them praying tahajjud, praying isha, then tahajjud. And then during the day they stood their ground. It absolutely shocked the armies of King Rodrigo. Because they could see that, wait a minute, these people, this is a different force that we are reckoning with. Eventually, they gave in, and on the 8th day, the army of King Rodrigo collapsed and gave in and just escaped. Many of them just ran for their lives. Many of them just completely disappeared. It is said that King Rodrigo as well was never to be found again. Many people say he was either killed in battle there, or that some say he threw his armor and disappeared into some villages to become a hermit for the rest of his life. What is known is that he definitely does not appear again. Absolutely disappears. And Muslims and Tariq ibn Ziyad and his armies with him, when they see this just happen, like 100,000 in front of them, Allahu Akbar. It is almost as though you are seeing, it is reminiscent to them of scenes like that of Badr. وَمَا رَمَيْتَ إِذْ رَمَيْتَ وَلَكِنَّ اللَّهَ رَمَى. That you did not throw when you threw, but Allah threw. It reminds them of like the du'as that the Prophet ﷺ made at the time of Badr. When he turns to Allah before throwing that dust and sand, and he turns to Allah and he says that in tuhlak hadhihi al-isabatu al-yawm. He says, if this group of people today collapse and are destroyed, la tu'badu fil ard, you will not be worshipped on this earth. And then he threw. And Allah says, وَمَا رَمَيْتَ إِذْ رَمَيْتَ وَلَكِنَّ اللَّهَ رَمَى. This is what it reminds them of. It reminds, at that time, it's reminiscent of all the other successes that you see right through the seerah. That other things, Yarmouk, the Battle of Yarmouk with the Romans, the Battle of Qadisiyah, you see with the Romans and Persians, you see where the numbers were heavily outnumbering the Muslim armies. And historians have found that to be sometimes very difficult to digest. And they've said that how could this be, and there must be huge exaggerations and so on. Now, some exaggeration is admissible. I mean, there will always be some exaggeration, but astronomical, no. And the answer to that is, well, how could this be? Well, this could be because the belief, the determination, the objectives of the different sides was that between the heavens and the earth. It was so different. I mean, one set of people had landed there not only to liberate, but what they had their eyes on and their vision was something much greater than this. They could see nations and civilizations like rising under the banner of Islam ahead of them. They could see that. And what does the other side see? It simply just sees, oh, we're just defending, and many people don't want to be there. They just see it as, oh, these people are just, just some invaders, or they're just this and they're just that, and we just have to squash them, and all we're doing is really just fighting in the name of this king who he isn't really just, and he's not very good to us anyway, regardless. So this, Allahu shattana ma bainahum. It is so different what is between them. And you see this really becoming evident as the Muslims because once the army gives way, the Muslims advance north. And they continue to head north. And what happens is they head from there into what is one of the largest and at the time, most fortified cities almost. One of the most fortified, which was Ishbiliya, Seville. And it's interesting, Allahu Akbar, that when they arrived there, because along the way there were small towns, smaller other, not as popular type of, places, but still reasonable settlements and stuff which had come under Muslim rule. And the Muslims, what they would say is when they would enter a place, is that either we give you one of three. They say either that you accept Islam and you keep all of your possessions, or two, that you pay the Jizya, which is like a citizenry type of protection, like a citizenry type of tax, if you like, that since you're a subject to Muslim rule, and for you to be protected by Muslims, you will pay tax, an annual tax, and you get to keep all of your possessions, or you stand against us and we will make our stand, and that is qital, and that is that we will fight. And they say وَلَا نُؤَخِّرُكُمْ إِلَّا ثَلَاثٍ, and that was quite often almost a sunnah by which Muslims liberated or conquered different regions, that they gave the option of these three, and they gave 3 days as a period of time for them to think over it. And many of these places were so shocked that they were like, wait a minute. And I know people say, you know what people say? They say, everybody is just as pathetic, and everybody was just as ruthless, and Muslims were just as ruthless as other people. And people, look, being good or bad is from human nature. And people, regardless of their faith, will be good and bad. Nobody is denying that. Nobody is denying that maybe some oppression was ever carried out, some oppressive act or transgression didn't ever occur. But we're talking on significant historical scales. It is documented that Muslims, they gave the option of these three and they honored them. It is documented not only in Muslim but also in Christian history that when Muslims entered these lands in the Iberian Peninsula, like Seville, they opened the doors to them. Why? Because they were shocked that the news had reached them about the smaller settlements that were already taken over by Muslims, and the fact that they actually said to them, you get to keep all your possessions, you get to do all this, you see, before them, what were they used to? The Roman Empire, the Visigoths. What were they used to? They were used to somebody just comes, they ransack your town or your city, they enslave your men, women and children, they burn to the ground whatever they can, they rob whatever they can. There's no such thing as, I'll tell you what, enter this way of life and you keep everything. Or will you just give a tax in a year and you stay as you are? It was unbelievable. So people didn't believe it was true. But when the news reached them that, from this particular town that the Muslims are there and they've already practiced in this particular way, they were like, well, in that case, what's the problem? And the jizya is something we'll just shortly, take a look at. But these things are very interesting to kind of consider. That yes, human beings, no matter where they are, they may all commit injustices, and nobody is saying it was a fairy tale where nothing bad ever happened, but on a substantial scale, on a historical scale, did they treat the citizens of the towns in which they entered the same way that other armies were treating them? Hell no. And that is, you don't even need to go to the Muslim sources. You can go to other historical sources to verify that. So I'm just saying, because people do at times say that, well, that's just biased because I'm sure Muslims will. Well, that's not true. Okay? So that's just to clarify that for us. There are, along the way, there is certain interesting things. There is a narrative that when Tariq ibn Ziyad was faced by by this huge number, 100,000, many of his soldiers wanted to head back because when the reinforcements had come, but there were only 5,000, they wanted to head back. And so what Tariq ibn Ziyad did is he burnt the ships, and he says this khutbah. And nevertheless, the khutbah is quite awesome. He does say to them that he says that the sea is behind you and death is in front of you. And he says, وَلَا مَلْجَأَ لَكُمْ إِلَّا سُيُوفُكُمْ, and the only resort you have is your swords. And he says to them, basically resort to them, and in other words, like Khalid ibn Walid said, I'll see you on the other side. It was one of those. It is an interesting narrative. However, its authenticity really has been challenged by actually many Muslims. Although really, in a way, it is, I suppose there's two sides to it. In one way, it can look bad upon the Muslims that why would he do something like this and endanger all his people and so on and so forth, and burn ships which don't belong to him, and especially when the Muslims didn't have so much naval expertise and stuff or assets and stuff like that. On the other hand, it could be seen as an act of like almost of heroism and seen as quite, very brave and courageous. However, when you do look at it from an academic and ilmi perspective, you find that two historians had actually narrated it. That it was Abu Abdullah Muhammad Idrisi in the 6th century Hijri, who dies in 562, who narrates it in his book Nuzhatul Mushtaq. So we're talking you're looking almost like 500 years almost after this event has happened, does it first get documented. With him is a contemporary, Abu Marwan ibn Kardabus. He also, that's a contemporary of Al-Idrisi. And Idrisi, by the way, is that famous, the geographer Idrisi. It's the same one who traveled huge parts of the world. And then they are followed by somebody who's a later contemporary to them by the name of Muhammad ibn Abdullah Himyari in his book Rawd al-Attar. And in these books do you only ever see the mention of this incident. Yet before him, right from the very early Muslim historians, starting off with Ibn Abd al-Hakam, and many of his students and children and so on, who were famous for documenting history, none of them document it. Ibn Qutiyya from Al-Andalus, who is actually from the Goths, and Qut means the Gothic, and he kept his name. Ibn Qutiyya is a famous historian, writes about the conquest of Al-Andalus. He doesn't mention it. Ibn Fardi, who's early as well, Andalusi, Maliki, he doesn't mention it. Khashani, who once again, North African, Maliki, he doesn't mention it. Ibn Hayyan, even as the centuries start to go by into the 400s, Ibn Hazm doesn't mention it. His student Humaydi doesn't. Ibn Bassam Shantarimi, who's a contemporary to Idrisi, doesn't mention it. Even after him, Ibn Bashkwal doesn't mention it. Ibn Azari al-Murakishi doesn't mention it in his historical book. Abdul Wahid al-Murakashi doesn't mention it. Even Abdul Rahman ibn Khaldun doesn't mention it. Neither Ibn al-Khatib. None of these people mention it, which kind of goes to show that maybe the story doesn't really, in that case, not maybe, really doesn't have any authenticity. But it is interesting, nevertheless, whilst it was there. It does show that whole, that how to kind of, when people, I suppose, are desperate, they do desperate things, and the determination of people is quite interesting. And it reminds us, there's a poem that Jo kuch na ban para to dabo denge safina. There's an Urdu poem. That jo kuch na ban para to dabo denge safina. That if nothing, as a last resort, he says, will drown the ships. Sahil ki kasam minnate tufana karenge. That no matter what, he says, I take an oath, we won't beg the storm for mercy. And it is interesting that you see sometimes the determination of people when they are put in certain situations. Nevertheless, what we do see here today is how certain people who rose from just very almost like simple backgrounds. So you're seeing people like Tariq ibn Ziyad, who the child of a Berber convert, who not only joins a military expedition but then eventually becomes the governor and in charge of a region which is Tanja, and then eventually leads this expedition into the Iberian Peninsula to eternalize his name in history. And what he does with him, obviously he takes the message of Al-Islam. And you will see, inshallah, in the following lesson, how then not only more and more regions enter into the fold of Islam, how that then has a huge impact on the civilization. Tariq ibn Ziyad himself, what is he except almost like a student almost of Musa ibn Nusayr, somebody who once again eventually who rules and governs entire North Africa almost, and is in charge of making these decisions and these strategic type of plans and objectives, and going about, pioneering these type of conquests. And who was he except the son of a Christian captive who decided, Nusayr, who decided to embrace Islam when taken by Khalid ibn Walid. And you see, once again, so not only you see the input of Musa ibn Nusayr, but this whole, how the scene had been set out by Uqba ibn Nafi', a companion from the time of the Prophet ﷺ. So you start to see these events and how one person does something and it almost sets the scene for future events to kind of unfold and unroll. So inshallah, with that, we've learnt today, we've gone over the conquest and liberation of North Africa. We've looked at who was Uqba ibn Nafi', some of the struggles he faced. We understood how he kind of set the scene really for the advent of Musa ibn Nusayr, with a bit of background into him, Tariq ibn Ziyad, how he comes along, kind of accompanies Musa ibn Nusayr, and then eventually rises to such grandeur. What was the political backdrop of the Iberian Peninsula with King Witiza, who is then disposed of and replaced or betrayed by King Rodrigo, and how King Rodrigo then carries out his injustices, including that against King Julian of Sabta, against his daughter, and then how that then has an impact upon the Muslim objectives, because Julian then wants to aid the Muslims and supply them certain insight into the Iberian Peninsula. We looked at how the Muslims prepared for that, how they spent up to almost a year planning and preparing, making ships, doing things like that, sending almost a vanguard, a small group led by Tariq ibn al-Malik to just investigate and scope the region, to get maps, to understand, to come back with this insight, and then to do things with insight and not rushed or not in haste. And we see how that eventually is that culminates with Tariq ibn Ziyad crossing over onto Jabal al-Tariq, Gibraltar, and then onto mainland Spain, and which finally reaches its end with the Battle of Wadi Barbat, when King Rodrigo brings an army of 100,000 people who still crumble in the face of 12,000 Muslims who had arrived from North Africa. So we took a look at that. We also understood a very little amount. We took also a brief look at the incident of the burning of the ships, really to understand that it is an interesting story, although speaking truly more than anything, it was perhaps just fiction, since none of the early Muslim historians had documented it, apart from some who came almost 500 years later. So with that said, inshallah, I think we've concluded today's session. We will go into next session into how things advance, how they kind of play out with Musa ibn Nusayr, because he then once again arrives on the scene. How some Muslim armies under the leadership of Musa ibn Nusayr decide to head westward and almost end up 30 kilometers away from Paris, and how such a success then is met by such tragedy with what it became known as Balat al-Shuhada. And what was Balat al-Shuhada? So we will end up discovering that, and then looking into what happens in Al-Andalus after it becomes so rapidly liberated and conquered. Inshallah, with all of that done, I take ijazah. Do remember me in your kind du'as. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.